Overall, I thought last night's episode of The Acolyte as a season finale did a decent job of wrapping up what it absolutely needed to, and I ultimately think it and episode 5 were the best episodes of the show. Both of these episodes, I think, emphasized the things that the show was pretty good at, but there was also more of the stuff the show wasn't as good at in this finale compared to episode 5 as well. In the strengths category, I've really enjoyed all of the lightsaber duels and action in the show. I've talked about in basically every review how your mileage may vary on the use of the kind of martial arts stuff in the fights, but I really enjoyed that, and I think it added to the fights overall. Thanks to some of the elements like the Cortosis and Chymere's Shoto, that's his short lightsaber, we were able to get some pretty fun choreography in that fight. What Chimere did with throwing the lightsabers and then coming in from 3 different angles kind of reminded me of what Kreia does in Knights of the Old Republic too, where rather than fighting you directly, she kind of just has 3 lightsabers that float around her, although this was a definitely more physical and limited version of that. Story-wise, I think the overall plot of the show worked for me. Like, if I'm looking at the broad strokes of everything that happened in the show, I enjoyed what happened, I enjoyed several of the characters, especially Chimere and Soul, and on paper, I enjoyed the journey that Osha and May kind of go through. I'd been speculating for a while that May would probably be more open to what Soul was saying, not necessarily forgiving him, but turning around on the immediate anger and vengeance, whereas Osha, because of how much she trusted him and how she felt about the Jedi, that betrayal would be so much stronger. And I think that's ultimately what we got. But where the show has been weakest for me has been in the moment-to-moment execution of those kinds of plots. Often the dialogue felt very stilted, and I think the pacing and the way the show got from point A to point B a lot of the time wasn't particularly effective. Like, I understand the reasons why May, Osha, and Soul made a lot of the choices they did in the moment intellectually, but emotionally, it didn't really resonate with me. It didn't really land the way that I think it was intended to. I also don't really love the way that the show heavily used so many quotes from the movies in this episode. I know that's a fairly Star Wars thing to do. It's one of the things I complained about in a lot of the early TapCap episodes, though, where we were doing some of the early Star Wars Legends novels. The way a lot of those tried to establish themselves as being a Star Wars was by having these recognizable dialogue lines that they would use almost ad nauseum. I understand the intent is to kind of symbolize or mirror some of the experiences the characters in the movies went through, but I feel like I would have been able to pick that up without it being so on the nose, and that's the way I feel about the flashback episodes. I feel like there was some more opportunities to do either deeper or more interesting stuff in some situations, especially with those flashbacks, but there were a lot of instances where it kind of felt like the show was trying too much to hold the audience's hand. The areas where I felt like the show was the most compelling were the areas where they kind of dropped that, and they let the audience get to their own conclusions. At least to a slightly bigger extent. The stuff that's going on with Chimere and Vernestra, we didn't really get any kind of resolution to. That seems like it's setting up for a season 2, and there was enough here to make me excited for a season 2 if it happens, but with the way that streaming is currently going in general, I'm not sure if that's going to be the case. But the whip-like marks on Chimere, the fact that he has this Shoto, which is traditionally a weapon that was used in other novels to fight light whips, that was giving us enough information to make these connections without the show having to be so explicit about it up front. They definitely were by the end of it, and that was kind of necessary to set up why Vernestra would go out of her way to hide the fact that Chimere was involved in this, but I think that kind of thing worked a fair bit better. As a finale, it did answer the main question that it needed to of how May and Osha would react to the information about Brendok coming out, and kind of resolving that plotline. But much like with the Vernestra and Chimere stuff, I really don't think we have a full conclusion to May or Osha's stories. And much like with Chimere and Vernestra, I'll be disappointed if we don't get to follow that up in another season. I did also appreciate how willing the show was to dive into some of the deeper parts of the lore. Despite a lot of the complaints, I think this is a show made by people who really do appreciate the lore, especially the expanded universe. Many of the biggest complaints about the lore we had answers to by the end of the show, like why Ki-Adi would think that the Sith weren't involved in this. And more importantly, I think this actually sets up an ability for Yoda to learn about the Rule of Two if it goes forward. It's perfectly fair to say you don't like how it resolved that, but the idea that they just broke the lore there doesn't really hold up. Aside from a new Supreme Chancellor showing up in live action, we also got the live action debut of Darth Plagueis in a very brief cameo. And I've seen some complaints about this disrespecting his lore. Like, I saw a complaint that he wouldn't be skulking around in a cave, but that's how we get introduced to him in the novel. He and Tenebris are in a Cortosis mine, and that's how he kills his master. Legends Plagueis was no stranger to cavern skulking, and this is something that very clearly comes through if you actually read the book. So especially in such a brief cameo where he's spying on his apprentice, I really don't think this is out of character for him. We have such a limited window with him, and it shows what it needs to about what he's doing. We now know that despite the use of the Virgins, there were mistakes made in Anastasia trying to make May an Osha. But if Plagueis is able to figure out what Osha is, then this is kind of right up his alley and would feed into how he does some of his experiments later. So again, whether you agree with or disagree with the specific choices they're making, I think these are choices they could only have made if they did have a solid background in the lore that they're working on. Overall, I thought the show was decent. I thought there were some episodes that I really enjoyed and some that really didn't land for me. Ever since that initial announcement, I've been talking about how it and Andor were my most anticipated shows. Unfortunately, it didn't live up to that mark for me, but I did have fun with what we got. Thanks for watching though. We'll be doing a full discussion with Eckhart's Ladder tonight about this episode and the season as a whole. Hope to see some of you there. And we'll be getting back to more of our regularly scheduled lore videos.